Okay, good afternoon. I know that the day has been long. It's certainly been informative and most stimulating, I hope, for everyone present. I'm going to talk to you, as Prof has mentioned, about Pan-Africanism and its impact on Africana studies. And as others have mentioned, we know that there are certain issues now with Africana studies and questioning the significance and so forth. But I think that is one thing this particular conference should point out is that it does have a great impact on the lives of students, that there's much to learn about our global situation as well as our domestic situation from studying Africa. At UCLA, where I graduated from, we had T-shirts that said, when you study Africa, you study the world, and that's more than a joke, because the world has been in and not only out of Africa for a very long period of time. I start with a quote, a proverb that says, "How do you eat an elephant?" To which one says, some of you know this, don't you know this? How do you eat an elephant? That's right, one bite at a time. To address the question of race, cultural adaptation, cultural identity, and Pan-Africanism in the New World Order is to some degree an enormous, unwieldy elephant. The enormity of the elephant is shaped by the relationship between what we call global Africa and its diasporas and the New World Order in the 21st century on the one hand, and the relationship within global Africa itself on the other, as Prof has just mentioned. The question here is global Africa's ability to develop in spite of those new or old world orders. The latter relationship, however, is a more crucial one, in part because these world orders, which exacerbate the relationship. But I contend that the latter relationship, that is the old world order, is more crucial one because global Africa is capable of competing and succeeding in the 21st century. I know that flies in the face of what many people think, but I happen to believe that it's true. That capacity, as we have been advised over the last 150 years or so, lies in a clarity of purpose and vision grounded in substantive, concrete analysis and planning for our New World Order. For those of you who don't know, I've been working on the African Union, for example, and was commissioned to publish a book on the African Union for secondary school. There's a whole nother manuscript that I have that would be more appropriate for this level. But one of the things that we don't give enough time to thinking through is how the African Union has the capacity to make substantive changes, even though there's a great deal of interference with its work on the one hand, and there is a lack of sustained funding for that work on the other. But I think the potential is there. My purpose is to offer a comparative analysis of global Africa's historical and cultural response to those declared world orders as a prescription for her health and for her descendants, both on the continent and in the diaspora. The significance of a cultural historical analysis is best summarized by Amilcar Cabral in a 1970 speech he gave at Syracuse University in New York. He states, quote, "Culture is simultaneously the fruit of a people's history and a determinant of history. By the positive or negative influence which it exerts on the evolution of relationships between people and their environment, among those people and groups of people within a society, as well as among different societies." And this is sort of where we are. That is our elephant. How are we going to chew on this? The first is the creation of the diaspora outside of the African continent in Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Its creation constitutes historical and cultural response to enslavement and racism and the dual legacy of colonialism at home and abroad. We forget that the Caribbean was actually colonized. It was a colony itself. And so when we're talking about colonies, we're not just talking about faraway colonies, Africa or Asia. We're also talking about Cuba, which is really important in understanding that dynamic, but the Caribbean and South and Central America as well. The second is the transfer of Pan-African leadership from the diaspora, which occurs in 1958, and I'll talk about that in a minute, from the diaspora to the continent after the 1945 Manchester Conference. The third is the Sixth Pan-African Congress in Tanzania in 1974, which illuminated some of the internal contradictions within global Africa's response to racism and oppression. This third view leads to our present situation, which focuses on the shift to the continental Pan-Africanist, the internal contradictions it revealed itself, and the unanticipated impact it had on the African diaspora, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Now, since I have written about this, I also have to say that one of the components of the AU that was a real struggle from about 2002 to about 2 years ago in 2008 was the recognition of the diaspora as a sixth region of the African continent, and we're still working out how that's going to work. To restate the obvious, the historical factors of enslavement and colonialism, which created the diaspora and Africa's economic dependency, have bequeathed the legacy of racial and ethnic turmoil, cultural syncretism and confusion, and a struggling Pan-Africanism. Part of that historical legacy is the Western definition of race and cultural identity, which served as a lightning rod of discord within the human family. For people of African descent, that legacy shifted the culturally defined relationship between the individual, or in the case of Africa, the ethnicity, his and her sense of belonging, between the individual and his or her sense of their personal wealth and worth, and between the individual and his or her output or labor. So these things had very traumatic impact on not just the collective, the social being, but quite a bit of an impact on the personal sense of who we are as people within our larger social context. That legacy shifted Africa's culturally defined relationship between leadership and accountability by superimposing an enormous extraneous worldview burdened with oppositional ideas of humanity, human worth, and social cultural accountability and responsibility. During the 19th century, that legacy also superimposed a Western concept of national sovereignty over ethnoculturally defined global populations. Moreover, with the Western concept of nation-state itself in its infancy at that time, this superimposition destabilized the ability of diverse ethno-political cultural entities to evolve internal policies based on their internal needs. Now, what I'm suggesting here, as Prof has mentioned, other people have mentioned, that in Africa, the definition of self was not as African. It was as Igbo or Zulu or Khan or whatever. But these are not tribes, and it drives me crazy when people say tribes, because there are actually more people in certain areas of Africa who identify as a particular ethnicity than there are, say, French, for example. There are more Yoruba than there are French on the planet. There are more Africans who speak French than there are Frenchmen who speak French. Why? Because of the density of the population, but also the age of humanity in those particular regions. So when you're talking about a tribe, you're really undermining the enormity of this whole historic and cultural experience. So for those people who were Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Hausa Fulani, who had established governments and governed in autonomous environments, to be dismantled, and I think we talked about being dismembered before we could be remembered, to use Toni Morrison's phrase, was a traumatic experience beyond belief. And so the idea of talking about Nigeria, for example, where most of my work is done, is complicated by the fact that inside of this place called Nigeria actually exist 4 or 5 other countries, not to mention the smaller ethnic groups, but actual living political viable situations. And this was one of Nkrumah's problems when he came to power, because the chiefs wanted to maintain control over their particular regions. And the Akan have three major kings. They call them chiefs, but they were actually kings of their own regions. So this complicates our understanding of Pan-Africanism, but also complicates some of the issues and obscures some of these issues that became very important for us to grapple with in the 21st century. St. Clair Drake, for example, provides the seasoning for our elephant by making a distinction between traditional or racial Pan-Africanism and continental Pan-Africanism. Drake defines traditional or racial Pan-Africanism, I think this is what you would call classical Pan-Africanism, as a unity of sentiment and actions between individuals in Africa and the diaspora. He states, quote, "Worldwide black consciousness is a psychological reserve that can be mobilized to achieve local ends as well as to aid others as the liberation struggle continues."